Do you remember reading A Tale of Two Cities? Maybe in high school, or if you're like me, much later and you listen to it. Still counts, right? Still counts. I found it one of Charles Dickens's most, maybe complicated novels, the plot and all the characters. But I also found it one of the most compelling. It begins with that iconic line, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." It was set in 18th century France and England in the midst of great social upheaval. The scene at the end is extraordinary. A man, Charles Darnay, had been wrongly imprisoned in Paris. His father-in-law, wife, and child are being hunted down for execution. But a colleague of Charles's, named Sidney Cotton, arrived in Paris. Sidney was described as good for nothing, a drunk. He had wanted to marry Charles's wife, but she chose Charles, to whom Sidney bore an uncanny resemblance. Shockingly, Sidney secured safe passage away from Paris for Charles's family. He then found a way into the prison where he tricked Charles, his look-alike, into changing clothes with him. Sidney then drugged him and called the guards to take away the unresponsive Charles, who the jailers thought was Sidney. The story closes with Sidney going to the guillotine in the place of Charles. As he was being transported with other prisoners, he comforts a poor, anxious woman who had also been sentenced to death. He repositioned her in the carriage so that her back then faced the guillotine and she couldn't see what was happening, and told her, "Keep your eyes fixed on me all the way to the end." And then he held her hand before her time came. "But for you, dear stranger, I should not be so composed," she said, "nor should I have been able to raise my thoughts to him who is put to death, that we might have hope and comfort here today." The blade fell. Then it was Sidney's time. Knowing now that this act had given meaning to his life, he said, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." And with that, the book ends. Friends, the first line of our first reading sounds, rather sadistic, as though the Lord finds pleasure in crushing the person with infirmity, with pain. But the pleasure originates from the one who freely enters into the brokenness of the world to heal it and bring new life. The crushing is like the crushing of grapes, which allows for the possibility of new wine, a symbol of joy and fullness of life. My good people, our life as a Christian is oriented in that direction. I was reminded of that in a podcast I listened to this past week. They were discussing the fertility gap and the difference between the number of kids that people say they want and the number that they actually end up with. And one of them said, well, the research suggests it's in part because of the cost of kids. And the other one said, well, kids cost everything and nothing. Financial investment, yes, and extraordinary moral, mental, and emotional investment too. But the rewards as parents and grandparents make the costs seem as nothing in comparison. priesthood and the consecrated life are directed in that way too, but so is the whole of following Jesus. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slave of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Don't be afraid to enter into the brokenness of this world. Hold the hand of those who are anxious and distressed. Give faith to the impoverished and the overlooked. Bravely bear hope into the darkness of illness, hurt, and loss. Will you do that perfectly? No. At least I won't, at any rate. But as our second reading said, Jesus is sympathetic to our weaknesses. So don't be afraid to give your life for others. It is a far, far better thing to do than all else that could be done. It is a far, far better rest that awaits us than we've ever known.